The wilderness hides dangers we can barely imagine, and some encounters leave an unshakable mark on those who survive. From the eerie stillness that greeted four friends deep in the Bitterroot Mountains, to the massive, impossible footprints discovered at a remote RV park near the Okefenokee wetlands. In this video, we'll dive into 6 stories that reveal moments of unimaginable terror that blur the line between reality and the unknown. On September 17, 2025, the quiet waters of Lake Ravine lay hidden beneath a shroud of morning fog deep within the Carpathian Mountains. The lake stretched cold and ancient, surrounded by dark pine ridges and steep glacial cliffs that trapped the mist like smoke in a bowl. When the Ranger Patrol found the drifting motorboat that morning, it moved slowly in circles near the center of the basin, its small outboard engine sputtering against the current, a soft, rhythmic sound echoing through the emptiness. The hull was torn open along one side, the aluminum bent inward as if something massive had struck it from the water. The craft rocked lightly as the patrol boat approached, revealing deep, deliberate gouges scored across the deck. The Rangers tied off and stepped aboard, and what they saw made them fall silent. A family of 4 sat inside, motionless, each still upright in their seats. There were no signs of violence, no signs of a struggle, no bruising or visible wounds. Their eyes were closed, faces calm, as if they had fallen asleep mid-conversation. The scene was too precise. Jackets were neatly folded on the benches, fishing rods stacked along the side, thermoses upright beside an untouched picnic cooler. Nothing had spilled, nothing was broken except for the boat's radio, shattered into fragments beside the steering column. The ranger who examined it said the metal looked twisted, as if crushed by a single heavy blow. Around the edge of the torn hull, the aluminum bore faint residue that smelled like burned oil mixed with something animal, a sharp, acrid scent that lingered on their hands long after they left the boat. The family had arrived at Lake Ravine 3 days earlier for a short autumn trip. The weather had turned colder than expected, and locals remembered warning them about the heavy fog that rolled in each evening. The father, a man named Daniel Ionescu, was an experienced outdoorsman, and his wife Elena and their 2 children had grown up hiking the valleys below. No one in the nearby village heard their motor that morning, and no distress call ever came through the Ranger's frequency. When investigators began their work, the boat was hauled to shore for examination. The gouges across the deck were clean and deep, spaced far apart, as if made by massive fingers rather than claws or tools. Along the inside of the hull, dents curved inward, symmetrical and heavy, as though something had gripped it from beneath the water and crushed the metal before letting go. The radio fragments were melted at the edges, and its wiring had been torn from the panel in a single motion. The bodies were found to have no signs of drowning or hypothermia. Their lungs were clear. The coroner wrote that the cause of death remained undetermined, though all 4 had suffered a form of acute cardiac arrest without trauma. The expressions on their faces suggested calm rather than fear. That, more than anything, unsettled the men who handled them. It was as if they had simply gone still together, in the same instant, without resistance or pain. A search was conducted along the shore. The air was thick with fog that hung low over the water, carrying a faint metallic taste that made the men's eyes water. Then they saw the tracks. Enormous barefoot impressions, each over 2 feet long, pressed deep into the mud, leading away from the waterline. The stride was long, heavy, and deliberate. They led up the bank into the pine forest before vanishing among the moss and fallen needles. Several trees along the slope were snapped high above human reach, their splintered trunks angled in the same direction, as if pushed aside by something of great mass moving through with purpose. The men followed the prints until the mist thickened so much they could barely see one another. The forest had gone completely silent, No birds, no wind, not even the distant ripple of the lake. Only that faint chemical odor hung in the air, impossible to identify, but strong enough to make one ranger cover his mouth with his sleeve. When they finally turned back, one of them swore he heard a sound behind the fog, a slow, deliberate exhale that echoed across the tree line. Yet nothing was visible when he turned. The official report described the event as an unexplained boating accident. The hull damage was attributed to a possible collision with submerged glacial debris. But the men who were there never forgot what they saw. The prints were documented in photographs that were later lost, and the plaster casts taken that day were said to have crumbled before they reached the evidence room. No animal native to the Carpathians could have left impressions of that size, and none could have snapped trees clean at the height they found them. Weeks later, a biologist visited the site, drawn by the mystery. He spent 2 days camping near the northern bank, collecting samples from the water and soil where the boat had been found. On the second night, he woke to the sound of something massive stepping through shallow water just beyond the reeds. He stayed inside his tent, too afraid to unzip it, listening as the footsteps circled once around his camp, then receded into the forest. In the morning, his perimeter line had been pulled from the stakes, and several large impressions led directly into the trees. He left that same day, refusing to return. Months passed. Snow came early that year, sealing the lake under thick ice. Locals stopped fishing there, claiming the water no longer felt right. The few who ventured close said the forest had grown strangely quiet, that even the crows avoided the shoreline. One hunter, crossing a ridge above the basin, claimed to have seen steam rising from a break in the ice near the center of the lake, followed by a dark shape moving beneath it. To this day, the Ionescu family's case remains open but unresolved. Their belongings were returned to relatives, though the items taken from the boat still carried that sharp smell weeks later. The hull itself was eventually destroyed, after tests failed to identify the residue around the tear. The files were closed under the category of environmental fatality, though the language in the final report was vague and uneasy. Those who worked the investigation agree on one thing: that whatever had struck that boat and taken its passengers did so without hesitation or cruelty. It moved through their world with silent certainty, leaving behind only the echo of its passing. And when the wind dies and the fog settles over Lake Ravine, some say the stillness feels almost deliberate, as if the forest itself is waiting for something to rise again from beneath the water. On August 19, 2023, a remote telecommunications tower high in the Rhodop Mountains went silent. The signal, used to relay emergency transmissions across southern Bulgaria, ceased abruptly at 3:42 a.m. There was no storm, no power surge, just a final burst of static that pulsed rhythmically, like slow, heavy breathing. 2 days later, a maintenance team reached the site after a rough climb through dense pine forest and narrow switchbacks. The front gate lay twisted on the ground, its hinges torn apart. Fence posts bent outward, as if something immense had forced its way out rather than in. Around the base, the soil was patterned with enormous barefoot impressions, more than 2 feet long, pressed deep into the dry mud. The prints led from the tree line toward the compound, then vanished among the ferns. Inside, the door to the control room hung broken. The frame was warped outward, the latch crushed flat. The men stepped in cautiously, expecting fire damage or signs of vandalism. Instead, everything was still. A heavy table had been dragged several feet across the floor. A metal locker lay toppled on its side, and every piece of furniture had shifted toward one corner of the room, as if pulled there by a single powerful force. The air carried a sharp, acrid odor, like oil and ozone mixed with something animal. The 2 technicians assigned to the outpost, Petar Stoyanov and Milan Tanev, were gone. Their beds were unmade but unruffled, their phones, jackets, and wallets still in place. One mug sat on the counter with coffee dried at the rim, The generator out back hummed steadily. Power had never failed. Investigators arrived from Smolyan that evening. They examined the tower's base and found 5 deep gouges cut vertically through the concrete, each several centimeters deep, ascending nearly 3 meters high. The marks were smooth inside, as though something impossibly hard had dragged upward. Nearby, several pines were snapped halfway up their trunk, the wood twisted rather than cleanly broken. Around their bases, the search team found coarse black fibers clinging to the bark, too long and rigid to match any local species. When the site's data drives were retrieved, the final log showed 8 seconds of that rhythmic static before total silence. Audio specialists said it was interference from metal resonance. Others noted how unnaturally even the pulses were, like measured breaths recorded through layers of distortion. Search teams swept the surrounding slopes for 4 days. They found only a torn piece of uniform cloth and a bent flashlight half buried near a ravine. No blood, no drag mark, and no animal tracks were discovered. At one point, dogs refused to advance beyond the clearing, whining and pulling away. The air there carried that same metallic scent the maintenance crew had reported, stronger and almost unbearable. Inside the building, nothing made sense. Every loose object had shifted in the same direction, from floor to ceiling, as though an invisible weight had pressed through the structure. Yet there were no cracks, no signs of pressure from outside. The steel door, though warped, showed no trace of an explosive force. On the floor near the far corner, several hard drives lay stacked neatly beside one another, removed carefully from their slot. No fingerprints were found. By late August, the case was classified as an industrial disappearance. The company welded the gate shut and installed remote monitoring systems, so no one would need to stay there again. The new technicians sent to repair the transmission refused to remain after dusk. They reported faint vibrations underfoot, as if the ground itself trembled rhythmically in time with their heartbeat. Some said they heard low, distant sounds, long exhalations beneath the soil that faded when they spoke. Winter sealed the site under snow. When spring thaw came, a small patrol returned to check the tower. Nothing had changed. The twisted trees stood dark against the clearing, their bark dry and blackened, their tops snapped in the same spiral pattern. The gouges in the concrete looked freshly carved, unweathered despite months of wind and frost. Rumors spread in the nearby villages about strange lights drifting between the ridges at night, pale amber glows moving low to the ground before vanishing behind the trees. Officials dismissed them as reflections from maintenance vehicles, but those who had visited the tower said otherwise. They claimed the air around the structure seemed to pulse faintly, a quiet vibration that rose through the soles of their boots, steady and deliberate, like the tower itself was breathing. No sign of Petar or Milan ever surfaced. Their families received compensation, but no explanation. The final report blamed mechanical fatigue and environmental stress, noting that wildlife likely destroyed evidence. Yet no known animal could twist steel beams, snap full-grown trees halfway up, or leave footprints that size. Today, the Motorboat tower remains automated and unstaffed. Its frame leans slightly where the foundation cracked, and though power flows again, technicians say the signal sometimes dips at the same hour the original failure occurred. The rhythm lasts only seconds, repeating every few weeks, soft pulses echoing faintly through static before fading back to silence. The official logs call it interference. The engineers ignore it. But those who've stood at the edge of the clearing at night say that if you listen closely between transmissions, the air hums in slow intervals, deep and deliberate, as though something vast still moves beneath the mountain, breathing softly through the steel. On October 27, 2007, the weather in the North Cascades had turned gray and damp, the kind of day when clouds hung low enough to brush the trees and the creeks swelled with the sound of cold, rushing water. Two hikers, Daniel Ward and Eric Hanley, had decided to follow an old service trail that ran parallel to a narrow stream, a path long unused since the small hydro station that once stood at its end had been shut down decades earlier. Moss covered the wooden footbridges. The trail was soft with rain, and the air carried that thick smell of wet pine and stone. They moved quietly, listening to the constant trickle of the creek, and it was during a slow descent through a tight bend that they saw something ahead, a dark, human-like shape seated on a boulder in the middle of the stream, facing away from them. At first, Daniel thought it was a lone camper, someone taking a break by the water. The figure was broad-shouldered, still, and slightly hunched, but what caught their attention almost immediately was the sheer size of it. The width of the shoulders, the unnatural length of its arms, and the way the head seemed slightly too low between the shoulders, as if the neck were buried beneath muscle. For a few seconds, they hesitated, unsure if they should approach. The shape didn't move. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic rush of the creek. The air felt heavier there, quieter somehow, and even the forest seemed to hold its breath. Daniel called out softly, his voice carried away by the water, but there was no response, no flinch, no sign of recognition, just stillness. Then, as they took another cautious step forward, the figure moved. It didn't turn to look at them. It simply rose from the rock, unfolding upward in a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to stretch far higher than either of them thought possible. The scale of it hit them instantly, easily over 7 feet, maybe more, shoulders massive, torso covered in something dark and coarse that clung damply in the mist. The figure stood there for an instant, motionless, facing the opposite bank, and then, without a sound, it stepped once, a stride that covered several feet and slipped behind the trees. There was no crack of branches, no splash of water, no sign of its passage. It was as if it had melted into the forest. Both men froze. The shock held them still until the silence became unbearable. Then instinct took over, and they turned back the way they came, following their own trail with shaking hands and quick, clumsy movement. They didn't speak until they reached the old ranger station several miles downstream. When they did, their voices trembled as they tried to describe what they had seen. A man, but not a man. Something too large, too silent, too deliberate in its movements. Later that afternoon, they returned with a park ranger. The forest was quiet again, the fog heavier now, draped between the trees like a curtain. The boulder in the stream was still there, slick with water, glistening under the dull light. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints on the rock itself, no discarded gear, nothing human. But along the muddy bank near the edge of the water, just beyond where the figure had been seated, they found impressions. At first glance, they looked like footprints, but far too large, nearly twice the length of Daniel's boot. The prints were deep and sharp, the toes clearly defined, and there was no sign of shoes or tread mark, only bare, enormous outlines pressed deep into the soft mud. The ranger crouched down, touching the edge of one with his glove, studying it for several seconds without speaking. He suggested it could have been distorted bear track, melted together by the rain, but neither Daniel nor Eric believed that. The prints were too symmetrical, too human in shape, and too heavy in their impression, as if whatever made them had weighed far more than any person could. They followed the prints for several yards along the creek before they faded into the stones, vanishing where the ground turned rocky. Nothing else remained. No trail, no hair, no broken branches. It was as if the forest had swallowed whatever had been there without leaving a trace. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. Every sound outside the cabin seemed amplified. The wind against the walls, the creak of wood, the shifting branches. He kept replaying the moment the figure had risen, the immense weight of it, the way it moved so smoothly, like an animal but upright. He tried to convince himself it had been a person, someone in thick clothing, maybe a hunter in camouflage, but nothing about it fit. The silence, the height, the way it vanished. Over the following days, rangers checked the area again, mostly out of curiosity. They found nothing. The mud had dried, the creek level dropped, and whatever footprints had remained were washed away. The report listed the sighting as unconfirmed, with no indication of danger to hikers. But Daniel couldn't shake what he had seen. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the outline of that shape, immense, motionless, sitting by the water as if waiting for something. Locals would later tell stories about that stretch of creek, about strange sounds at night, about heavy breathing in the fog, about eyes reflecting light deep in the woods where no animals stood. Some said the creature had been seen before, always near running water, always in mist or twilight, always gone before anyone could get close. Daniel and Eric never returned to that trail. Years later, when they spoke about it again, their memories hadn't faded. The silence, the sheer scale, the unnatural calm of the thing before it moved. It wasn't the fear of what it might have done that haunted them, but the quiet certainty that it had been watching them long before they noticed it, waiting by that creek as if part of the forest itself. And though no proof was ever found, those deep, barefoot impressions in the mud, seen by 3 men before the rain washed them away, remained the only trace of something vast and unknown that had stood in the Cascades that cold October morning, before disappearing back into the endless green silence. On the 1st of August, 2001, 4 college friends, Caleb, Mara, Ian, and Trevor, set up camp deep in the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana, miles from the nearest road. They had chosen a small clearing beside a slow-moving creek, a place marked only on older maps, the kind that listed forgotten trails and faded ranger cabins. The air was warm that afternoon, the forest dense and rich with the scent of pine and dust. They pitched 2 small tents, built a fire ring, and talked until the flames burned low. The night came still and cool, with no sound except the steady flow of water and the soft hiss of wind through the trees. The first night passed uneventfully. In the morning, they woke early, cooked oatmeal over the embers, and spent the day hiking higher along the ridges where sunlight broke through the canopy. It felt remote in a way that few places still do, the kind of wilderness where silence pressed down heavy and no contrail cut the sky. They returned to camp in the late afternoon, sore but content, and as night fell again, they sat by the fire and listened to the hum of cricket and the far-off call of a nightbird. There was no sign that anything watched them from beyond the tree line, yet the forest seemed strangely attentive, as if it held a breath of its own. When morning came, everything was wrong. The first to step out of his tent was Ian, who stopped cold, staring at the ground. The tents, both of them, had been moved during the night, rotated precisely to face north and south, their stakes still tight, their guy lines perfectly realigned. The fire pit was cold, but the stones around it had been rearranged into a tight ring, symmetrical and deliberate. Their coolers were stacked in a pyramid beside the stream, lids closed and straps secured. Not a single sound had disturbed their sleep. At first, they tried to explain it logically. Maybe a prank, though no one else had been out there. Maybe animals, though the arrangement was far too careful, too human. Then they noticed the tracks. Large, barefoot impressions in the soft dirt near the edge of camp, deep and clean. Each step was wide apart, with long toes splayed in the mud, far too big for any man. The prints led away toward a narrow ravine just beyond the tree line, and then stopped abruptly, as if whatever made them had vanished mid-step. The rest of the day passed under a strange, oppressive quiet. They stayed close together, speaking in low voices, scanning the forest for movement. The feeling that something unseen was close began to grow heavier, as though the trees themselves leaned closer. That night, the air turned cool again, the moon pale behind drifting cloud, and none of them slept easily. Around midnight, a sound began, low at first, almost a vibration in the chest more than in the ears. It was a humming, deep and resonant, circling the camp in slow, deliberate arcs. It didn't come from any direction they could pinpoint. It seemed to shift, fading and rising like breath, too steady and too low for any human throat. They sat awake until dawn, eyes fixed on the black edges of the forest. Nothing moved, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. When morning light finally cut through the mist, Caleb noticed his boots were gone. They searched every corner of the camp, even the creek, but found nothing until Trevor spotted something high above them, hanging from a pine branch nearly 20 feet off the ground. Caleb's boots, tied neatly together by their laces, were dangling in the breeze. That was the moment panic set in. They stopped trying to reason it away. The arrangement of their gear, the footprints, the humming, and now this. It was too precise, too intentional. Whatever was out there wasn't trying to scare them off in a frenzy. It was studying them, testing their reactions, almost like it wanted to see what they would do next. By midday, they decided to leave. They packed quickly, refusing to linger. The forest had turned utterly still again. The wind gone, the sound of insects gone too. Every snap of a twig beneath their boots sounded unnaturally loud. As they descended the ridge, the feeling of being observed never left them. More than once, Mara looked back and thought she saw movement between the trees, a shift of shadow, a suggestion of something massive standing still against the trunks. But whenever she stopped, there was only silence. They reached the trailhead by late afternoon, exhausted and pale, refusing to speak about it on the drive back. When they finally reached town, each went home separately, and none returned to the mountains that summer. Mara later said she never truly felt alone again outdoors, that the memory of that place stayed with her like a pressure at the edge of her mind. Over the years, as word spread through nearby towns, locals began avoiding that area altogether. Hunters claimed their dogs refused to enter the upper ravine. A few campers reported waking to strange humming in the distance, deep enough to vibrate the tent walls. No wildlife was ever trapped there, and no sign of bears or mountain lions was found. Forest rangers chalked it up to misinterpretation, echoes from the valley, the sound of wind resonating through the slopes. But those who knew the story of the 4 students avoided the subject. Of the group, only Mara ever spoke publicly about what happened. She described the incident not with fear, but with quiet certainty. She said it hadn't felt like a predator circling them. It had felt like curiosity, as though something vast and intelligent had found their small human rituals intriguing. The tents turned, the objects rearranged, the humming that pulsed through the dark. All of it seemed like an attempt at imitation, an exploration of their world by something that didn't belong to it. None of them ever camped again. The site remains avoided by locals to this day, a place overgrown and silent where even the animals seem reluctant to pass. And though no one ever proved what had been there, the memory of those perfect footprints, vanishing into the ravine without a trace, lingers like a question the forest still refuses to answer. The work site known as Timber Hollow lay buried deep in the Bitterroot foothills of northern Idaho, a forgotten patch of logging ground abandoned since the late 1980s when the company that owned it went bankrupt and left everything to rot beneath the moss. The forest had long since reclaimed the roads, erasing the paths with undergrowth and soil until only a rusted gate and a scattering of warped machinery remained to mark where men once worked. In March of 2021, a small crew of 5 lumberjacks was sent to dismantle what was left, remove the old equipment, clear the trails, and prepare the land for a new timber operation scheduled for later that year. None of them expected the silence that hung over the valley, or the way the air itself seemed heavy with moisture and something sour, a faint organic musk that clung to their clothes and tools from the first day onward. The team set up a temporary camp beside the access road, where the cracked concrete pad of the old saw house stood half buried in ferns. The first day passed without incident, though all of them noticed how sound carried strangely through the hollow. Their shouts and the whine of the saws bounced back in distorted echoes that seemed to shift direction mid-air, sometimes returning sharper and closer than the original noise. They blamed the shape of the valley, the thickness of the trees, and the fog that drifted through even in daylight. But when night came, the forest changed. The wind died, and a steady sequence of rhythmic knocks began echoing from somewhere beyond the tree line. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more, repeating at irregular intervals, as though something out there was mimicking a signal. By the second night, the knocks came earlier, and the smell had grown stronger, pungent and earthy, mixed with the metallic tang of rain-soaked soil. In the morning, when they stepped outside their small trailer, they found a neat pile of freshly cut logs stacked near the path where none had been the day before. The cuts were clean, the bark peeled back in long, rough strips, and yet no one on the crew had done it. The nearest tree that could have been felled lay untouched. They assumed it was a prank, maybe some local hunters trying to mess with them, but the nearest town was nearly 20 miles away. On the third night, a light rain fell, coating the ground in slick mud that reflected the glow of their floodlights. The knocks started again, closer this time, echoing from multiple directions at once. One of the men swore he heard breathing between the trees, low and steady, almost like the slow exhale of something massive. Still, when they searched with their flashlights, there was nothing, just mist, wet bark, and the gleam of water dripping from branches. That night, none of them slept more than an hour. By the 4th evening, the air inside the hollow felt different, thicker, charged somehow, as if the fog itself carried weight. Dean Foster, the foreman, stayed up late checking their equipment, moving between the trucks and the generator. Sometime after midnight, one of the workers, Aaron Mendez, looked out through the window of the trailer and saw movement near the slope. Beyond the light cast by the generator, where the trees began to rise again into darkness, something was standing still between the trunks. It was upright, immense, motionless, its outline faint in the rain. For several seconds, it did not move at all, the shape broad-shouldered and slightly hunched, with long arms hanging low. The mist rolled past its outline in thin waves, and the light from the camp shimmered faintly across what looked like wet fur or a slick surface. Then, without a sound, it turned, or seemed to, and vanished behind the trees in a single stride. By morning, Dean was gone. His truck was still running near the slope, headlights cutting through fog, driver's door open, engine idling. His jacket lay folded across the seat, and his thermos sat upright in the cup holder. The ground around the truck was disturbed, not by struggle but by drag marks that led several meters downslope before ending abruptly beside a boulder. They searched the surrounding forest for nearly 3 hours before finding his body in a shallow gully, half covered in leaves and damp soil. His clothes were torn, one boot missing, his skin marked by deep scratches and bruises along his arms and ribs. Though there was no sign of attack from any known animal, his expression was calm, his eyes open, as if whatever had taken him had done so without violence, or as if the life had simply gone out of him all at once. Investigators from the county sheriff's office arrived that afternoon. They examined the body and the area, but found no clear cause of death, no broken bones, no bite marks, no head trauma. The coroner's report later described it as cardiac arrest, brought on by extreme stress or shock, though no one could say from what. Around the site, they found enormous barefoot impressions, each more than 2 feet long, circling the clearing and descending toward the ravine. The prints were deep, pressed evenly into the mud, showing clear arches and toes. Nearby, several trees were snapped halfway up their trunks, twisted as if by violent force. The remaining workers refused to stay another night. They packed their tools and left the hollow before sunset, abandoning most of the equipment where it stood. The company canceled the contract within a week, citing environmental instability and unsafe terrain. Since then, no crew has returned to dismantle what remains. Timber Hollow still sits in silence, its rusting machinery slowly sinking into the soil, the forest swallowing what's left. Hunters passing near the area sometimes report the same distant knocking, faint and rhythmic, carried on the wind. No official link was ever made between the sounds and Dean Foster's death. Authorities dismissed the larger tracks as distortions caused by rain and runoff, though several officers later admitted off-record that the impressions had been too symmetrical, too perfect to be accidents. Those who knew Dean said he was the kind of man who feared nothing, who had spent his life working the woods. Yet whatever had come to Timber Hollow that night had undone him completely, swiftly, silently, and without leaving a trace of what it was or where it went. The forest remains untouched now, a place avoided by logging crews and hikers alike. When the fog settles low across the hollow and the wind drops away, those who pass nearby sometimes swear they hear it again, the slow, patient rhythm of wood on wood, echoing from somewhere deep within the trees. On the night of August 13th, 2022, the remote RV park near the Okefenokee wetlands had fallen into the kind of silence only found deep in the swamp, where the trees stood thick and the water stretched in hidden channels beneath a veil of fog. Guests had settled into their trailers early, the hum of generators and the occasional distant call of frogs, the only sounds breaking the stillness. By midnight, a sudden storm rolled in, the wind gusting through the cypress and Spanish moss, shaking the tin roofs of the RVS and rattling the lattice of branches above. Rain fell in sheets, drumming on the rooftops like a relentless percussion, but that was only the beginning. Around the lot, several RVS were violently rocked as if gripped and shaken from outside. One trailer lurched against its stabilizers, sending loose items clattering to the floor. The sound of objects hitting metal echoed through the lot, drowned intermittently by the heavy rain, yet somehow distinct, thuds that could not be explained by wind alone. Outside, the air smelled damp and earthy, a sharp undertone of musk lingering over the usual scent of wet foliage. The wind carried it in waves, thick and pungent, that seemed almost alive. One awake occupant, a man who had been reading on his small cot near a window, glimpsed something that froze him in place. A massive fur-covered hand had pressed briefly against the glass beside his bed, the skin beneath coarse hair outlined in a way no human hand could match. It stayed for a heartbeat, enormous and deliberate, before vanishing into the dark swirl of trees and rain. He blinked, heart pounding, convinced the storm had played a trick, until a second, slower pressure seemed to roll across the roof and side of the RV, like a weight passing over metal. When morning came, the storm had moved on, leaving behind a thick, humid calm. The forest beyond the RV lot was silent. No birds called, no insects hummed, only the squelch of soft mud underfoot and the faint trickle of water along the access path. Guests emerged cautiously, scanning the lot for damage. Everything inside had been shifted. Coolers had been emptied and stacked in a precise line leading toward the swamp, lids aligned, contents removed with care. Chairs, folding tables, and small camping gear had been rearranged neatly, corners flush, as if someone had wanted to catalog and observe each item. The ground told the most compelling story. Deep, barefoot impressions, well over 2 feet long and pressed sharply into the wet soil, traced a line from the tree line to the edge of the RV lot. Each step was deliberate, balanced, and impossibly wide for a human stride. The prints ended abruptly at the tree line, as though the maker had simply vanished into the darkness of the swamp. Several prints bore impressions of long, widely spaced toes, spread evenly, with nails faintly pressed into the mud. There were no claw marks, no signs of dragging, only a series of impossible footprints, each more than double the size of any human foot, precise in their spacing and depth. Park authorities arrived shortly after sunrise, surveying the lot and talking to guests, though none could offer more than fragmented descriptions. The official report cited the storm and local wildlife as possible explanations, noting the heavy rains could have shifted items or created impressions in the mud. But even those investigators admitted off-record that the sheer size of the print and the arrangement of the coolers defied casual explanation. The RV park closed temporarily after the incident. Maintenance crews found nothing further out of place, though the lingering musky odor persisted for several days. Guests reported unease for weeks afterward, describing a feeling of being watched even within the safety of their vehicles, a subtle pressure in the air that seemed to move with them. A few claimed they saw shadows moving through the distant trees at night, low and slow, vanishing when approached, the same deep, rhythmic hum faintly audible on the wind. No one was harmed, and no direct confrontation occurred, yet the psychological impact was significant. Those who had glimpsed the massive hand or observed the rearranged objects described a sense of intelligence behind the movement, an intentionality that no animal could replicate. The creatures that roam the Okefenokee, bears, bobcat, alligators, were incapable of lifting entire coolers, stacking them, and moving without leaving more obvious signs of their passage. Guests and investigators alike agreed it had not been chaotic or random. It had been careful, observant, deliberate. Over time, local stories began to circulate. Campers and hunters passing near the park spoke of strange vibrations in the mud, of footprints larger than any human could make, and of glimpses of massive silhouettes moving silently among the trees. Some described the same low, resonant hum they had heard that night, echoing faintly through the swamp like a distant drum. No recordings captured the sound clearly. No cameras recorded the movement, yet the impressions in the ground and the rearranged items were undeniable. By late August, when the park reopened, staff installed motion lights and sensors, though the initial setup failed to capture anything extraordinary. The area remained under observation, and while no similar incident was reported immediately afterward, the section of the RV lot where the coolers had been stacked stayed unused, cordoned off as a precaution. Guests who returned were uneasy, their tents and RVs oriented with a subtle avoidance of the old stack's location. Even in daylight, the line of mud where the barefoot impressions had led to the swamp seemed to draw the eye, an invisible weight that pressed on the mind more than the senses. Years later, the incident at the Okefenokee RV Park remains a reference point among local guides, swamp hunters, and cryptid enthusiasts. They tell of the storm, the hand at the window, the coolers stacked like specimens, and the giant footprint that led into the darkness without end. Authorities never confirmed what had happened, citing weather and wildlife, but the people who experienced it firsthand never returned to that part of the park and rarely speak of it to outsiders.